Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 4 team selection, but I really wanted to go through my dilemmas in my team just because I have a couple of them and I think they're actually really important to talk about just so you can understand my thoughts and feelings on my FPL team and how I plan to address the issues. The first thing I'd say about FPL management is, to me, the best advice that I've ever read is you need to fix your issues first before sort of looking at upside. And hopefully, of course, by fixing your issues, you're also maximizing the upside that your team has. And right now, I think the biggest team problem that I have is João Pedro. João Pedro is someone who, based on last week's comments from Roberto De Zerbi, particularly the embargoed press conference that came out after the deadline, suggested that he doesn't really belong in the starting 11 for this Brighton team until he's able to adapt to Roberto De Zerbi's system. And my experience of Roberto De Zerbi is he's not a manager who really maximizes short-term results. He really does prefer to stick to his own beliefs. And if, let's say, someone like João Pedro doesn't really fit into a system at the time being, I don't think he's going to get consistent starts. The good thing with Roberto De Zerbi is I do think he's also quite an honest manager. So if there's ever the chance that João Pedro can start this weekend, then we'll probably get that news too. As far as João Pedro though, based on the news that we have, I'd have to expect him to come off the bench, which means that he's not worth it as a starter this week. And my issue with this week is that I have two bad defenders on paper, with Estupiñán and Saliba having very, very tough games. And then obviously having to play with João Pedro as well isn't particularly good versus Newcastle, especially if he's coming off the bench. So who are my transfer options? I think in reality, the safest transfer option possible is going to be Ollie Watkins, but I'm going to immediately discount him because I don't think the fixtures are good enough. I think what's beautiful about Ollie Watkins, and if I was an Ollie Watkins owner, I would generally consider holding, unless you have two free transfers and can go into Jackson, is the simple reality that you know he's going to start every game. You know he's going to have very good minutes, unless, for example, there's a midweek cup fixture, which was the case in Game Week 2. But in reality, you don't have to deal with the issues that, for example, I myself have to deal with now as a João Pedro owner. You can then just simply go to Jackson. And Jackson, unfortunately, is someone that I don't have access to, simply because I'm tripled up on Chelsea already. And so I would say Jackson's actually still the best forward for the time being, because you've got a guarantee that he's going to play a lot of minutes. They still haven't signed any sort of other strikers to compete with him. They have Broja coming back, but he's still at the end stages of his rehabilitation program. And in reality, I still don't see Broja taking too many minutes away from him in the short term. And so my realistic picks are going to be Isak, Alvarez, and the crazy differential punch out, of course, is going to be Darwin. So let's actually first talk about Isak. Isak is an option that I think is interesting because now that you're looking at this Brighton team so far, they've been a very, very poor defense, and we know, and we have a lot of confidence as well, that this Newcastle team is a very good offense. What does concern me, of course, is that when you look at last season too, there is going to be eventually a time in the season where I think Isak will actually come off the bench and Wilson will start. And my concern is that could even happen as soon as Game Week 4. So I feel like Isak feels good because he's had 3 consistent starts so far. But look at the time when he gets subbed off. Usually in the late 60s or the early 70s. That's not really good enough from a forward, in my opinion. Now, the fixtures are getting better for Newcastle, but I don't have a guarantee that he's going to be a consistent starter for the time being, so I don't really like the idea of going with him. In the meantime, though, you could say that Isak is probably worth it because he has the same sort of risks that someone like an Alvarez possesses. But the bigger issue that Isak presents to me is the simple reality that I can't go from Shaw, who's another issue in my team, to Trippier in Game Week 5, because Isak, unfortunately, is a very costly striker, particularly with the price rises. I only have 2.9 million in the bank. Going from João Pedro to Isak is effectively a 2.2 million move, and then I only have 0.7 million to upgrade Shaw, which is not possible. And so I don't really like Isak for that reason, and I'm just going to move on quickly towards Alvarez. Alvarez is the most logical play for me, but there is a chance, of course, that he himself can already lose his starting position in the team. What we saw last week was a Man City team featuring Alvarez, Grealish, Bernardo Silva, and Haaland up top. So you can arguably say that at this moment in time, particularly with Kovacic and Rodri as the two midfielders, and you can even argue that, for example, based on Rodri's press conferences so far, that Rodri is playing a little bit more advanced and Kovacic is playing a little bit deeper. But that actually means, of course, that there's only 4 attackers in the team in this sort of default City lineup. Now, what's an interesting thing? I think the best City predictor that we've ever had on sort of FPL is Luke from Fantasy Football Scout. I think this Twitter post from Luke is a perfect representation of what Man City could potentially line up with at times. And what's a good indication of that? I think when you saw, for example, Foden coming on last week, Julian Alvarez didn't come off Instead, Kovacic came off. So there are going to be shapes that Man City can play where Kovacic is not needed. And actually, you could arguably say that City can play with 5 attackers. So that's the one thing that I have in my mind. There's probably a 20-30% chance that sometimes Man City will line up with 5 attackers as opposed to 4. And maybe you could even argue, particularly with European fixtures coming up, that Bernardo Silva can be rested instead. And the young kids like Foden and Alvarez can actually play ahead of him. Just because this is how Pep might manage the fixtures. What I would say, though, is it's still very concerning and that there's definitely going to be a risk on Alvarez. I think at this point in time, I would be comfortable saying that he's going to get 2 out of 3 starts, even though actually the interesting thing so far is that he's completed 4 out of 4 games. And he's the only player in the City attack to actually have done that. So that's a huge positive for Alvarez, but we know that one of the reasons why Foden himself has not completed that many games is purely because of the sickness last week. And that's a source of concern, because if they play a 4-attacker system, it's really Foden and Alvarez who are just fighting for those spots together, and that's my main issue. However, Alvarez is nice because he still allows me for that Game Week 5 move to Trippier, which is why I think he's going to be my priority transfer. And if we get any indication whatsoever that he can start again, then this is perfect, because there is so much short-term upside to this Fulham game. Actually, if you look at the goal-scoring odds, and I've been looking at them from Game Week 1 to, let's say, Game Week 8, actually, this City fixture is, on paper, their best attacking fixture because it's at home at the Etihad, and it's against this Fulham team that have so far been a terrible defense. Now, of course, Palhinha is back, but even when you look back at the Arsenal game, there are plenty of chances created by this Arsenal team. They just didn't really finish, and Fulham as well sort of overscored their expectations. So I do think that this City team, particularly at home, can absolutely demolish Fulham, and if Alvarez has a part to play here, there's a lot of upside to be gained from simply a João Pedro benching. So that's sort of why I'm in between these 2 players. And then the crazy punt, which sort of is a medium, because with Darwin having such a previously good game, he could have a start. But I think, of course, the concern going forwards is there's still going to be the chance that Jota finds his way towards the starting team, Gakpo as well, and Luis Diaz, of course, belongs in that left wing spot, unless, of course, they go back down to 10 men. So that's sort of the issue with going for Darwin. But the nice thing that Darwin presents me is he's also another player where, unless Shaw gets another price drop, at 7.3 million, I can still actually go for Darwin this week and then actually go for Trippier the next. I do think it's a little bit too tight, and I think it's too crazy of a shout without even seeing Darwin get a single consecutive start in the Premier League to go for him. So in reality, my first transfer dilemma, I would say, is probably going to be leaning towards Julian Alvarez if I was to have to deal with a João Pedro benching. My second dilemma, of course, is, Shaw is close to another price drop. I myself am a manager who doesn't really like taking price drops, but you also have to make sure that you get the best information possible. We have midweek cup fixtures still, and the news on Shaw is pretty bad because it seems like United are consistently going for and looking for another left back to bolster their team, and we know that Dalot clearly isn't enough, and that's why Man United are digging deep here. And of course, that probably also suggests that Luke Shaw's injury could be a little bit long-term. We don't really know the full diagnosis, but the initial comments were a few weeks, and since then, I've also heard a few months. And so he's clearly a transfer out, but the question is he a transfer out for Game Week 4 for me, or a transfer for Game Week 5? As I said already, if I go for Alvarez, it's very simple. I can just go for Shaw to Trippier in Game Week 5, and I can tank another price drop. But the alternative, of course, is that by owning Shaw, who knows? I could actually just go for a simple and maybe nicer move in the short term, maybe pass on the sort of punt that is Alvarez if he, let's say, continuously loses minutes now that Doku and even Mateus Nunes has been signed. And maybe I can instead just go for someone like Ruben Dias this week. It could help the team because, of course, the Fulham fixture is very good from a clean sheet perspective. And on top of that as well, you'd be happy to own a City defender going forwards. A lot of us are still looking to actually increase our amount of City defenders because they still look incredible. And so that's an option too. An alternative option, of course, from going out of Shaw is to go to Udogie because he also looks like a nailed starter for this Tottenham team. I wouldn't say he's going to play 90 minutes each game because Ben Davies is clearly there and a serviceable replacement and someone who can actually help the team, particularly when, let's say, Udogie is tired, given that he's a young player too. But Udogie seems to also scream a lot of upside in Game Weeks 4 and 5, so he's an option there that's sitting for me. And of course, that could actually increase a lot more of the money that I have in the bank, allow me to go for a Trippier in the future, and maybe actually allow me to consistently play a 4-5-1 until, let's say, Game Week 6, where I can maybe go for an attacker to upgrade João Pedro. But the beauty of actually playing a 4-5-1 until Game Week 6 is that I would actually get João Pedro back for the Bournemouth game. So that could be an interesting time where I can maybe actually improve my midfield once again, or maybe think about changing up my defense. And so that's sort of the two dilemmas that I have this week. But let's actually go on towards my team selection. I haven't actually locked in any transfers yet. As I said, I'm a manager who likes to wait for more information. I'm going to be waiting to the press conferences to extract my moves. But for now, I'm obviously thinking of rolling up with this sort of team. My defense is going to be Pickford, who has a very good game versus Sheffield United. A lot of people have been talking about how Pickford is a huge problem. In my opinion, when you actually look at, let's say, pass points, there's usually one or two standout keepers each season, but it's never the case really that they're consistent. Unless you're, let's say, Ederson, who plays for basically the best defense that we've seen in the Premier League for the last 5 years running. The issue, of course, is that even Ederson, for example, can have a bad season like last year where he just conceded a lot of chances from very, very low XG shots. But in reality, you always have a budget keeper that can do well. So far, it doesn't really seem like there's a standout option. I would actually argue that it actually looks like Areola at 4.0. Unfortunately, we missed the boat on that because we didn't really know whether he was nailed in Game Week 1, and I'm sort of stuck with Pickford and Turner. But I'd still like to see out the games because Pickford still has a good Game Week 4 fixture, and then of course in Game Week 5, we'll have to see what happens with Turner and his position in the team as the starting keeper. And in terms of my defense, this is another week where Chelsea have really, really good clean sheet odds. They're against Nottingham Forest, who we saw has consistently scored, and Awani himself is on the verge of breaking a potential Premier League record in terms of consecutive games scoring. But I've got Chilwell and Gusto here. I just think these are the best fixtures out of all my defense, and then I'm going to play Estupinian over Saliba. Saliba falls towards the bench, and I do have a quite weak bench this week, but at least it's going to be Saliba, who we know will play, so that's a little bit of a positive there. Estupinian just to capture the upside versus Newcastle. When I look at the fixtures on paper, Brighton versus Newcastle at home, and also Arsenal versus Man United at home, I do think that both teams will likely concede, particularly this Brighton team that have looked really, really poor as a defense. But ultimately, the nice little positive that we have going for Estupinian is he's still a very attacking player. And of course, we know that this Newcastle team's great, but if there was a weakness in terms of defense, it's probably still in terms of Trippier's one-on-one defending. We've seen in the past, for example, if you watch the Aston Villa versus Newcastle game last season, that an attacking fullback can absolutely destroy Trippier, and that was the case with Gerard Moreno last season. So I do think there's a little bit of upside there. I don't think this is a great game for Estupinian, but I'd still be happy to play him this week just because the landscape of defenders is very poor, and I don't really see myself going for a Ruben Diaz transfer. I think it does cost a lot of money, and I do want to be spending that sort of money on someone like Trippier in the short term. And so in the midfield this week, I'll be lining up with Mbeumo, Rashford, Saka, Sterling, and Fernandes. So reluctantly playing Rashford and Fernandes, but I still think that when you actually look at United's fixtures, they're very, very good for the long term. And so there's no reason to really be concerned about their fixtures. You have to sort of understand that as an FPL manager, you're going to have bad game weeks for your players. For example, if you're going for Bone this week, you've got 2 bad fixtures after this. If you're going for Madison this week, you've got 2 bad fixtures in game week 6 and 7. And most of the time, you can't really constantly change and chop players because you have other issues in your team. And so this is a simple case where because I'm not on a wild card, I don't have the luxury of making a midfield transfer. I'm also arguably one step ahead of the curve by going for Sterling in Game Week 3. And so I now have Sterling for Game Week 4, which looks quite appetizing. And I think, there's enough of the upside there in terms of Sterling from Game Weeks 4 to 8 still that I'm happy with him in my team. And so this is going to be my midfield. I actually think Mbeumo has the best fixture out of all my midfielders. Bournemouth seem to be a weaker defense, just because I also know that Iraola is quite an attacking manager. So that's quite a nice positive sign for someone like Mbeumo, who I've kept from Game Week 1. And if we move on now towards my forwards, I'm provisionally thinking about starting João Pedro and Haaland. As I was discussing though, I think it really just depends on me waiting until the press conferences, trying to get as much information as possible and potentially, let's say, Foden and his fitness, João Pedro and his ability to start before I make another move. So right now I'm planning on rolling, and the benefit of rolling is you have 2 free transfers going towards the international break. A lot of people do talk about the strength of 2 free transfers in an international break. In my opinion, if you have major issues for your team, it's always worth it to use that transfer because you're never going to capture that upside again. But of course, having 2 free transfers after an international break is always quite positive because, as we all know, there could be injuries in international games that could be unforeseen. Now, this is sort of how I'm planning to line up provisionally, but as I said, if I was to make a free transfer, it would actually be to replace João Pedro with Julian Alvarez. Just because I'm still okay with the defense this week, I don't really want to go with a City player necessarily, as I want to be spending that sort of money to Trippier in the short term. So I will be playing with João Pedro or Julian Alvarez, as you can see. And then my captaincy, when we talk about that briefly, I think it's very simply still on Haaland. Maybe we can talk about captaincy a little bit more this week because I know it's been a bit of a fresh debate since Haaland, of course, blanked in Game Week 2 and then obviously missed a penalty in Game Week 3. But for me, as I've been saying, this is City's best attacking fixture if you actually look at bookies odds. And so this is a good opportunity for me once again to go with the Haaland captaincy. And what's interesting too is so many people seem to be turned off by a Haaland captaincy that this could be a great week where Haaland could pay off really well for us. And as I've been saying so far, Fulham have looked like a terrible defense, and City have always been a better attack at home. A simple look at last season's underlying stats for City will just tell you that they created around 7 to 8 more XG at home last season than they did away from home. And on top of that, if you actually look at the goals scored, it's around 60 goals scored at home and 34 goals scored away from home. So that already tells you the quality that this City team has on attack at home. And I'm not really going to pass up on an Erling Haaland captaincy that looks this good. So that's why I'm going with Haaland. And in terms of the vice captaincy, I think you can actually go with either one of the midfielders that you're bringing in this week, like a Sterling, a Foden, or Maddison, or you can just go like me. I'm going with the vice captaincy over Mbeumo. I think he's got a fantastic fixture. Bournemouth don't seem to be a particularly good defense. I do expect their attack to continue to be consistent, but I'm going with Mbeumo as a vice captaincy, expecting, of course, that Erling Haaland will play, and that's going to be my team selection for Game Week 4. Let me know what your thoughts are on my team selection. Should I go with the Julian Alvarez move, capture the upside there, or are you worried about him losing his spot in the team in the future? Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.